think of your home like a sentence. You can have all the right words and still sound awkward if there's no punctuation. But high-end homes, they've got punctuation. They tell your eye where to pause, where to move, and what actually matters so the room doesn't feel like it's rambling. And the 6 things I'm about to share with you, well, they're where that punctuation comes from. Most people move into a home thinking they've covered the essentials. They've got the sofa, the bed, the table, and on paper, nothing is missing. And yet, a few weeks in, the space still doesn't quite settle. Nothing looks unfinished, but it just feels unresolved, like the room never fully lands. And when that happens, the default reaction is to add more. Another chair, more art, extra shelving, just something to fill those gaps. And so the room gets busier, and occasionally that helps, but more often than not, it just adds noise without actually fixing the underlying issue. Because the problem usually isn't that something is missing everywhere, it's that something is missing in very specific places you don't naturally think to design first. And the corners of your room are probably the most common one here, because corners tend to disappear. They're not part of the main seating area, and they're not where attention naturally goes. So they either get ignored, or they get filled half-heartedly with something small that doesn't really do them justice. And when you do that, your room can feel oddly hollow, even when it's fully furnished. Because what's missing in your corners isn't just any old object, it's vertical presence. And that's why a single tall plant placed deliberately in a corner can change the entire feeling of a room. And to be clear, I'm not talking about a handful of small plants scattered around or, that cluster of pots that's competing for your attention. I'm talking about one piece that gives the room height. Something that pulls your gaze upward and softens the hard stop where the 2 walls meet. Because without that vertical element, your corners just feel like dead ends. But once you introduce that height, your space really starts to feel resolved, and your room gains this sense of balance without becoming overly cluttered. And this works because the tree in the corner is doing a job that most people don't even realize needs to be done. I mean, just think about it. Just about all your furniture lives low to the ground. Your sofa, your chairs, your tables, they all sit on the same horizontal plane. But a tall plant interrupts that pattern, and it fills the upper half of the room in a way that just feels so natural. But I have to say, you do want to be specific about what you choose here, because the tree that you go with needs a clear silhouette and also enough scale to hold its own. So if you choose something that's too small or too thin, it'll just disappear, which is not the look you're going for. Or if you buck the trend and opt for several pieces at once, then your room is just going to feel busy again. So as long as you go with a tree that's got enough presence to it, one is definitely enough, because its role isn't to decorate, it's to complete your space. But once that corner of your room is resolved, something interesting happens. The rest of the room starts to make more sense. The seating area feels more grounded, the walls feel less bare, even though you haven't added anything to them, and the room stops feeling like it's waiting for something else to arrive. And that's the pattern you're going to notice again and again throughout your home. Like I said, the spaces that don't quite feel right usually aren't asking for more stuff. They're just asking for the right kind of support in the places we tend to overlook. And by the way, if you want to learn more about plants and how to integrate them into your home, I recently released my 5-step plants framework and a custom tool where you can upload photos of your room and get back upgraded images to show you how your room could look if you really get the plants right. That's how you can go from a room that looks like this to one that looks like this in a matter of seconds. So if you want to do that for your own home, check out the link in the description. Now, once you've spruced up the corners, your room will definitely feel better, but it's still far from done. And one of the things a lot of people notice around this time is that their living room feels a little bit loose, like the individual pieces of furniture would just drift apart if you were to nudge them. And when you feel that way, you'll start rearranging things, pushing stuff against the wall, pulling it back in, and doing anything you can in hopes that the room suddenly clicks. But most of the time, the layout isn't the problem. It's that the room just isn't grounded yet, because your furniture needs something to visually sit upon. Because without that, even great pieces of furniture will still kind of feel like they're floating. And that floating feeling is one of the fastest ways a room starts to feel unfinished, even when everything is technically there. So this is what rugs are for. Now, I'm not going to go super deep into rugs in this video because I do that in some of my other videos, but I will tell you the most common reason rugs fail. they're too small. And when a rug is too small, it doesn't anchor your room like it's supposed to. Instead, it breaks it into pieces. And more specifically, it fractures your seating area. The sofa gets segmented into one zone, the chairs in another, and the coffee table just feels caught in between. But a properly sized rug does the exact opposite. It pulls the furniture into a single shared footprint, and suddenly your seating area becomes clearly understood instead of a loose collection of objects, and your room stops feeling temporary and starts feeling deliberate. Now, what's interesting is how little everything else needs to change once that happens. You don't need more pillows or extra tables, and the furniture you already have actually starts behaving better because it finally has a foundation to rest upon. Now, once the rug is doing that structural work, something else becomes noticeable as well: how it feels. Because anchoring the room is only one piece of a rug's job. But when there's some contrast through the material or the weave of the rug, the space gains back some depth. And I won't comment on other parts of life, but when it comes to rugs, bigger usually is better, because a rug that has a sizable presence in the room feels confident, while one that's too small for the space just feels hesitant. And even if you can't articulate why, your eye picks up on that difference immediately. So if your furniture feels a bit out of place and you're tempted to keep rearranging it, that might be a cue that the room doesn't need a new layout, it just needs a rug to pull everything together. Now, another thing you might have noticed in your place is that it tends to get a little messy over time. I'm not judging, I'm just calling it like it is. And in many cases, that's because your surfaces never quite stay clear. And one of the biggest culprits for this is your coffee table, which slowly but surely turns into a landing strip. Remotes, chargers, coasters, that book you've been halfway through for 6 months. Sure, you shuffle those things around so they don't feel like permanent fixtures, but if you're honest with yourself, they've got nowhere else to go. And most people blame themselves for this. They tell themselves they need to be tidier and more disciplined. But remember, you can and should use design to compensate for shortcomings in your personality. Because even if you're not as tidy or disciplined as you'd like to be, you can design your home in a way that makes you act like a tidy, disciplined person would. Because the real issue here isn't actually your habits. It's that your room never gave your everyday items a place to disappear to. Let me explain. Living rooms work best when the things you interact with on a daily basis are close at hand but not constantly visible. Because when there's nowhere for them to disappear to, they become part of the visual landscape of the room, even though they were never meant to be. So this is where having a coffee table with hidden internal storage quietly changes how your living room behaves. Not as a feature piece, but as a release valve. Because when your coffee table itself absorbs what normally floats around the room, your surfaces stay calmer without any additional effort. So that means you don't have to constantly reset the room. Instead, your space stays settled because you never let clutter accumulate in the first place. Now, what's really interesting here is how quickly this shift actually happens. The seating area starts to feel more deliberate, even though nothing major has changed. The coffee table stops acting like a catch-all and starts behaving like a center point for the room again. And the room just becomes easier to live in overall because you aren't being bombarded by so many things all at once. But the key is subtlety. You want the storage to feel built in, not like it's bolted on. Because when it's well hidden, the room stays focused on what actually matters. And instead of fighting your space every day, your room starts working with you, quietly supporting how you live day to day. Now, once you've tucked away all your excess stuff and your room is a whole lot quieter, it's time to turn your attention to your walls. And most people technically have their walls covered. You know, they've got art and they've got frames, so it might feel like that box is checked. But the room still feels flat, almost like you're living inside a two-dimensional box. And that flatness can be pretty subtle, so you may not immediately register it as a problem. You might just feel that your space lacks a bit of depth, even though there's plenty of stuff to look at. Well, in situations like this, the issue usually isn't what's on the walls, it's that everything is living in a single plane. You know, prints, photos, posters, they're all framed the same way and all sitting flush against the wall. And so your eye moves across them, but it never really settles because there's nothing to pull you in. Because what's missing isn't more art, it's dimension. And this is where three-dimensional artwork completely changes the experience of a room. And when I say three-dimensional art, I'm talking about art that has some depth to it. You know, even just a little, because It introduces shadow, layering, and some visual weight that two-dimensional art just simply can't. And this can come in the form of a textile hanging on your wall, a carved wood panel, or just something else with some texture and thickness to it. And it doesn't have to be loud or oversized. It just has to exist in space, not only on the surface of the wall. Because once you add something like that in, your wall stops behaving like a backdrop and starts acting like part of the room. Light interacts with it differently. Its shadows shift throughout the day, and suddenly your entire home feels richer. And this is also why three-dimensional art pieces tend to feel more personal, because they don't look like placeholders. They look like they were chosen. And because they're providing more visual interest on their own, you actually need less of them. And one strong piece can replace several weaker ones without leaving the wall feeling empty. Because when your walls gain depth, your room gains patience. Your eyes slow down because they finally have somewhere to rest, and that calm starts to spill into the rest of your space, which makes your entire home feel better. Of course, I know some of you are going to push back on this, saying that three-dimensional art isn't a requirement for every home, and you'd be absolutely right. You can have a beautifully designed room with completely flat walls and nothing more than prints and frames. Because three-dimensional art doesn't fix a space, but it does refine it. And it's a pretty unique tool you can reach for once your room is already working, when you want it to feel calmer, richer, and more lived in, but not when you're still solving basic layout and furniture problems. So if you feel like your room is almost there but still feels a little rushed or restless, this is a pretty cool way to slow the room down, not by adding more, but by adding depth in all the right places. Now, let's take a look at your kitchen for a moment, because if you find yourself avoiding spending extra time there, you're not alone. A surprising amount of people try to spend as little time as possible in their kitchens because the space subtly encourages them to move fast, finish the task, and just get out. And one of the biggest reasons for that is poor lighting. I mean, just think about it. In a lot of kitchens, the only light in the room is coming from overhead, which means that the moment you step up to the counter, you're casting a shadow on the exact spot you're trying to use. And so without thinking about it, you lean forward and hunch over a little bit, or in other words, you work around the light instead of with it. And on its own, none of this feels like a real problem, but over time, the kitchen just starts to drain you. Everything takes a little bit more effort than it should. The cooking feels tiring and the cleaning is annoying, and it's because the space isn't doing you any favors. But that's what under cabinet lighting fixes. Because when light actually hits the counter, where your hands are and where the work happens, the entire kitchen experience changes. You can finally see what you're doing without leaning forward or casting shadows on yourself, and the kitchen just calms down without you changing the layout, the cabinets, or any other finishes. But a lot of people overlook how quiet this upgrade actually is. There's no new object fighting for your attention, or even a grand lighting fixture pulling your focus upward. No, the light stays hidden, silently does its job when you need it, and just disappears everywhere else. And that's exactly why it works so well. But people still skip over under cabinet lighting because they assume it's a renovation thing, something that's permanent, complicated, and expensive. But the impact has almost nothing to do with any of that. It comes from where the light is coming from. Because once your counter is properly lit, your kitchen stops feeling harsh and starts feeling supportive. And now, instead of rushing out of the kitchen, it becomes a space you actually want to spend time in. But just like all the other changes I've talked about, under cabinet lighting isn't adding visual noise. It's actually removing friction, and it just quietly allows the kitchen to do its job. Now, moving on to the entryway of your home, this is where the outside world meets your inside world. Shoes come off, bags get dropped, and your keys, mail, sunglasses, and all the other stuff you carry with you every day all arrive at once. And if there's nowhere for that transition to happen cleanly, the disorder doesn't stay contained. It starts to spread. Because most homes technically have an entryway, but very few have a landing zone. So the door opens and everything gets set down wherever there's space. That means on a chair, the kitchen counter, the dining table, wherever. And so what that means is that things don't pile up because you're messy. They pile up because your home never told you where they were supposed to go. There's no clear answer built into the space. And when that first moment of arrival is chaotic, the rest of your home never quite recovers. And even your tidy rooms are at a disadvantage because they're just one wrong move away from being completely disrupted. And this is why a real entry landing zone matters a lot more than most people realize. Now, to be clear, I'm not just talking about a few hooks on the wall or a shoe rack shoved into a corner. I'm talking about a defined setup that matches what actually happens when you walk through the door. So that's somewhere to sit, somewhere for your shoes to disappear, and one clear surface where your essentials can land without taking over your entire house. Because when that zone exists, something really important happens. Your clutter stops traveling. Your shoes don't migrate down the hallway, your keys stop bouncing between every flat surface in your house, and bags don't end up on the sofa because there's finally somewhere better for them to go. In other words, the home absorbs the transition instead of letting it spill outward. But what's surprising is how quickly this affects everything else. The living room stays calmer, the kitchen counters stay clearer, and even your bedroom feels more settled because the chaos never makes it that far. And just like the other changes we've talked about, this isn't about discipline or routines. It's about removing the decision-making from the moment you walk in. Because when your space already knows what to do with your stuff, you don't have to manage it. The house handles the mess before it ever becomes one. So you might have started this video thinking a high-end home just requires a high-end shopping list. But what I hope you've noticed by now is that none of these upgrades are about adding more stuff. They're about giving your home the support it's been asking for all along. A tree in the corner of your living room isn't decor, it's vertical structure. A properly sized rug isn't style, it's gravity. And three-dimensional art isn't even about the art, it's about depth. In other words, these aren't upgrades that change the look of your home as much as how your home behaves. And when your home behaves well, you feel it immediately, even if you can't explain it. And to be honest, that's what high-end is. The feeling that your home already knows what to do. Things land where they're supposed to land, and your space supports you instead of asking for your constant attention. And really, isn't that what we're all looking for from our homes? If you're gonna do anything after this, don't try to fix everything all at once. Just look for the one spot in your home that's bothering you and start there. Because a single thoughtful change can have a surprisingly big impact on your entire home, but you won't fully believe me until you see the results for yourself. And once you've made that change, if you want to keep upgrading your home, you're going to need a system to help you get there. So watch this video next where I walk you through a framework I've developed that'll take any room from average to impressive in a single afternoon. Cancel your Netflix, you got homework.